Next, we're going to look at a creative way that we can take the multiband distortion unit from Roar and combine this with a reverb to make a really interesting moving ambient pad. So the patch we'll be creating in this video is going to sound like this. So there's a lot of really interesting movement and ambience, but this actually just coming from our distortion and reverb combo. So this is the patch before. So on its own, it's a very generic detuned pad that has a little bit of a low pass filter applied to it just to kind of tighten it up, just to cut out some of those high frequencies. But then once we add in this reverb and distortion combination, and we really mess around with the modulation controls on the Roar unit, we can get some really interesting tones out of this patch. So let's go ahead and copy over that audio just so we have the audio material to work with. We will turn this down to -9, so that way it all matches. I'm going to change the color here. I can just right click and hit assign track color eclipse just to keep everything organized, but I will make sure to also include this patch and also the sample as well in the course materials. So you can download that to follow along, or you could add this to your own patch if you would like. Let's go ahead and load up the Roar distortion unit. So we'll drag and drop it in. And then we also will just grab the standard reverb inside of Ableton. And we'll crank that up to 100% wet. So that way we have a reverb. So we have the Roar unit feeding into a reverb. And then we're going to select both of those by holding Shift. And then we're going to right click or hit Command and G or Control and G to group them. Go over here to the different audio effects rack channels. And we'll create a new chain here. Drag that to the top. And then I'll right click on this and hit rename. Name this dry, and then we can have this as Roar and reverb. And also turn that down just a little bit as well, so that way it's not quite as loud. And then we're going to go ahead and solo that out just so we hear just our reverb and our distortion. And this is where we can really unlock quite a bit of interesting sounds out of this device, is once we start combining this with other effects. So combining it with delays to create all sorts of really interesting texture delay sounds, or reverbs, or even chorus sounds, or different distortions. By layering this device with all the other stock Ableton sounds, you can get some really cool stuff. We'll also play around with some of these reverb settings a little bit later, but the only one you want to have set up for now is going to be the dry wet. Make sure that's turned all the way to 100% wet, just so we have our full reverb sound. Okay, so let's go ahead and get set up on this patch. So we want to make sure that the input drive is turned up so that we were pushing this reverb a little bit harder, giving us a little bit more gain to work with. So let's go ahead and put that up to an amount of 8 just to get started. And let's pop this over to multiband. So that way we have the ability to shape each individual band inside our reverb. And the reason we'll be doing that is because then we have the ability to adjust each individual frequency inside of our effect. But we can also create some really interesting pumping and movement effects by modulating these filters for each of those individual bands. So it just gives us a lot of fun flexibility when it comes to modulation and movement. And that's how we'll kind of create this really interesting pumping reverb effect. Okay, so far it sounds like this. Could probably drive that just a little bit harder, just to give us a touch more gain to work with. And then let's play around with this tone control. I'm going to go ahead and change it over to this mode right here. What this will do is basically apply that tilt shift EQ to the input of our signal over here. And then on the output, it's going to apply the inverse of it. So what this does is gives us a little bit more full and balanced tones. So if I go and boost this up and show you what it sounds like with the other mode, this is much thinner, whereas this is much more full sounding. Because basically it's EQing on the way in and then doing the inverse of that EQ on the way out. So that's kind of pushing the distortion and pulling back on certain frequencies, but then we make up for them on the output stage. So 2 different ways of adjusting the EQ curve for this device, but that can give us a lot more full sounding tones, especially with this pad. I don't want to lose any mid-range, but we're going to push those highs just a little bit harder. Okay, so that is at 19%. So that way we're pushing more high frequency into the distortion, while also pulling back on the lows. So there's less low frequencies being saturated inside of our distortion. Then we can start messing around with those individual bands. I'm going to go ahead and turn off those other 2 for now. And let's go ahead and keep that on the soft sine shaper. This should be the default one, but we'll have that set up on our lows so that way we don't lose any of the bass. Which is one of the things I really like doing on this device is whenever I'm running this in a multiband mode, just like with some of the other patches, you can drive it really hard without losing all the nice sub characteristics inside your tone. So we can actually get quite a bit of crunch, but we're not losing that low end sub stuff. Let's go over to our mid-range frequencies next. So I'm going to solo those out. I will go ahead and push these ones as well. And this is where we'll start introducing some filtering, which we'll be moving here in a moment. Like that on the soft sine shaper. But feel free to play around with those different types of distortion. I like that kind of crunchy mid-range stuff. It sounds nice, but it's not overly harsh. Let's go ahead and turn down that filter so that we cut out some of those highs. We'll be moving this here in a moment, so we can always play around with this value once we have the modulation set up, but that's going to be at 98.1 for now. So even just that combined with our original sound gives us kind of really interesting textured reverb, and we haven't even brought the high frequencies in yet. So then we can move over to the highs. This is where we're going to add the most texture for our sound. So I'll use one of my favorite modes, which is going to be the noise injection mode. But again, you could use any of these. You could use the rectifiers. The trifold is fun as well, but this noise injection is going to add a nice level of texture to our sound. Because if we listen to the original, there's not much going on in terms of frequency content. It's a pretty generic pad. So there's a little bit of high frequencies and mainly just a lot of detuned mids, but there's nothing really happening. It has a nice texture, kind of a nice movement to it. So we can use this noise injection mode to add some really interesting frequencies to our sound that aren't present on the original patch. Let's go ahead and just leave that cranked all the way up. Then we can play around with the biasing control to adjust the overall texture and character of that sound. And what I'm looking for here is this point where it starts to kind of break up and almost give us like this glitchy stuttering effect. Listen to what it sounds like when I reduce this. It kind of comes through on that initial attack transient and then dies out, as opposed to this. So it gives us a kind of interesting movement that's not present on the original patch. But what we can use that for is just adding something that's a little bit more interesting to the front end of that whole sound. Because listen to what that sounds like in context. Now it's giving us this really kind of interesting texture for everything. And let's push the level up a little bit as well. Maybe like 7.1 or so. Then for this one, let's also take those highs and sort of pull back on them. We can put that at about halfway because we will be modulating that here in a moment. Okay, so then let's go ahead and turn on all those individual bands. So we're going to do lows, mids, and highs. And it's time to start modulating the various parts of the sound. So we're going to be using one of these ramped curves. So I'm going to go ahead and change this over to the ramp curve. You can see it actually has kind of an interesting shape to it. It sort of dies out of the front end here and then ramps upwards, giving us this almost kind of weird sidechain style effect, which is going to be quite cool for our sound. Also want that to be at 1/4, so let's go ahead and reduce that. And you can either click and drag on this, or you could use your arrow keys, the up and down controls, to go ahead and swap through those values. And then let's go ahead and go over to our matrix, and we can go ahead and start applying this to the different parts on our sound. So let's go to the Shaper 1 amount, that's this one over here. Let's go ahead and click on that, and we'll have that applied to our LFO, so that way that's adjusting and adding more distortion as our sound plays. So it sounds like this by itself. Gives us this interesting rhythmic distortion effect. Now let's go to our mid-range frequencies, and let's adjust that filter. So I'm going to click on this. We can increase this. And depending on how much aggression we want out of that distortion, we can increase this or reduce it. I think for us, amount of like 59 or so is nice. I think for us, an amount of 59 sounds good. Let's add in those highs and see what happens when we add just a little bit of movement to those high frequencies. So on this, I don't want quite as much movement on those highs, so we'll just do like a little bit, just so there's a bit of groove happening on those high frequencies. There we go, 4.7 is nice. Now we've created this really interesting pumping for that sound. We can then go to the output section of our synth. I'm going to click on this, and we're going to go ahead and apply just a little bit of that movement to the output volume. So that's the entire volume of my synth patch here coming out of this roar distortion. And we're going to go ahead and have that pump along with the rest of these parts here. Let's increase that a little bit. And you can definitely clip your output here as well. So you want to watch out for this red clipping icon here. So we don't want too much of that. Maybe like 3 or so, or just slightly under 3. There we go. So now we have just a little bit more movement without that LFO. Gives us kind of a generic sound, but with it, we're adding all this nice pumping into the sound. Then it's time for some compression. Let's go ahead and increase that until we get a nice compression tone. You could probably go pretty wild with this if you wanted. I think about there sounds nice, so we'll do like 32. Let's check these parts and make sure we're not clipping. There we go. A little bit of clipping could sound interesting, but in this case, I don't want this to be overly saturated. But in this case, I want to sort of control my saturation before I hit that output stage. So we could always dial this back a little bit too if we need to. Just so we don't have any of that clipping. Now it's time to play around with the size on our reverb. Let's go ahead and increase this to make it a little bit larger. This will just depend on the patch that you're working with. Let me go ahead and bring this back into the main signal here. Maybe a little bit larger, so we'll do like 2.63. Let's also chop out all those low frequencies too, so that way we don't have any low frequencies getting in the way of the rest of my sound. By itself, it sounds like this. Because this has a nice clear low end to it, we don't want the reverb to interact with the other low end in the main signal, so that way they're not phasing off one another, just creating mud inside of our sound. From there, last thing to do is adjust this to taste. So if you want more of that reverb or less of that reverb, you can adjust that here. Maybe dial back just a little bit, but it just depends on how ambient you want everything. So before we had a very generic sounding synth pad that was like this. And after, we had this much more dynamic and moving pad with this really cool reverb and ambience to it. So that's all for this video on creative multiband distortion and reverb processing. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.